The fire had settled into its middle-of-the-night rhythm, lower than the first hour, steady, the kind of burn that required attention every 20 minutes or so to keep it from going to coals. Elias tended it with the same patience he brought to everything, and the 5 hikers had arranged themselves in the specific configurations of people who have accepted a long night and made their peace with it. Greta had her back against the shelter wall with her legs extended. Sam had drawn his sleeping bag around his shoulders without getting into it, a compromise between warmth and the feeling that getting fully into the sleeping bag meant giving up on the idea of leaving. Priya sat cross-legged with her headlamp around her wrist, off, a habit she'd noted in herself and not examined. Marcus had not moved. Lena had filled 4 pages of her notebook. "The second movement," Lena said. She was reading back through what she'd written, the journalist's check. "What people bring into the mountains, what that means. You're saying the horror in these next stories is human in origin." "I'm saying it starts that way," Elias said. "Starts. The mountains receive what people bring," he said. "What they do with it isn't always what was intended." Priya looked up at this. "You're describing the mountains as agentive, as if they make decisions." "I'm describing what I've observed over 32 years, Elias said mildly. "You can categorize it however you like." "What did the Whittler bring?" Greta asked. She had the tone of someone who had already decided on the category and was comfortable in it. "That's the question," Elias said. He settled back. "The Whittler didn't think he was bringing anything. That was the problem." His name was August Lowe, and he had been coming to the Elk Garden trailhead every Saturday morning for 11 years when I first noticed him. Not hiking, sitting. He had a particular spot, a low, flat rock at the edge of the parking area near the trailhead sign, and he would arrive before the first hikers of the day and sit on that rock and whittle. Applewood, always. He had a source for it somewhere, a local orchard or a neighbor's tree, and he came with a grocery bag, pieces, and worked them through the morning with a short, fixed-blade knife that was clearly old and clearly cared for. By midday, he'd have a small collection of finished figures on the rock beside him, and as hikers came through, he'd offer them. Just hold one out and offer it. No price, no explanation beyond, "Made it this morning, if you'd like it." Most people took one. It was the mountains, and he was an old man, and the figures were good, genuinely good, the kind of folk carving that had a long tradition in this part of Virginia, the figures recognizable without being literal, each one slightly different from the others while clearly coming from the same hand and the same sensibility. Animals, mostly. A bear, a fox, a bird with its wings folded. Occasionally a human figure, though those were rarer and he seemed to offer them less readily, holding them back on the rock until he'd assessed a given hiker for a moment before extending them. I talked to him the first time in my second week of noticing him. Just the ordinary courtesy check, making sure he was all right, that he had water, that he knew the weather forecast. He was pleasant and direct, and he told me his name and that he'd been coming here for 11 years and that he found the trailhead a good place to work because the light was right in the morning, and he liked watching the hikers come and go. He said the figures needed to go somewhere, that he made more than he had room for at home, and that giving them to people who were heading into the mountains felt right to him. I asked him why it felt right. He thought about this for a moment. He was 70-something, lean, with the hands of someone who had worked with them his whole life, not just the whittling, but before that, something that had built the particular muscularity of his forearms and the specific calluses of his palms. He said, "The mountains give things to people who come here. I like the idea of people going in with something already in their hands, something that's been shaped by someone who knows this place." I thought this was a good answer, and I left him to it, and I didn't think about him seriously for another 3 years. The first incident I connected to August Lowe's figures was in the fall of my 3rd year of knowing him. A solo hiker, a woman in her late 30s, experienced, permitted for a 3-night backcountry loop, came out of the Lewis Fork Wilderness 2 days early and came to the visitors center in a state that I would describe, using the clinical language available to me, as significantly distressed.
She was physically unharmed. She was cogent and oriented, and she could give a clear account of where she'd been and what she'd done. What she couldn't give a clear account of was why she'd cut the trip short. She said, "I needed to come out." She said it in the specific way of someone reporting a compulsion rather than a decision, not "I decided to come out," but "I needed to," as if the coming out had been required of her by something outside her own deliberation. I asked her if anything had happened on the trail. She said nothing happened. She said it carefully, with the emphasis of someone who wanted to be precise. Nothing had happened to her. But she said she'd become aware on the second night that something in her pack was— she stopped here and tried several words and landed on wrong. Something in her pack was wrong. She'd gone through the pack item by item and found nothing obviously wrong with anything, and then she'd found the whittled figure she'd taken from the old man at the trailhead, and she'd taken it out and looked at it, and she stopped again. I asked her what she'd seen when she looked at it. She said it had changed. I asked her to be more specific.
She said the figure. She'd taken a fox, she remembered that clearly, had been a fox when she took it, the posture and the form clearly a fox. And on the second night in the backcountry, when she'd taken it out of her pack, it was still the same piece of wood, same dimensions, same knife marks, but the posture had changed. It was no longer a fox at rest. It was something— she said she didn't want to say what it looked like because saying it would make it more real than she wanted it to be. I didn't push her. I made a note and I told her she'd done the right thing coming out, and I drove her to her car. I went back to Elk Garden the following Saturday. August Lowe was on his rock with his bag of applewood and his knife and his morning's collection of figures. I sat down near him and watched him work for a while, and then I said, "Have you ever had anyone bring one of your figures back?" He looked at me. He had the quality of stillness that very old people sometimes have, not the stillness of someone who has stopped moving, but the stillness of someone who has learned that most things don't require movement. He said, "Once or twice." I asked him what condition the figures were in when they were brought back. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Changed." I asked him what he meant by changed. He said, "The wood moves." He said it simply, as if this were established fact rather than something unusual. He said, "Applewood is a living wood, even after it's cut. It responds to conditions, to the person carrying it, to the landscape it passes through." He said, "I don't make the figures so much as I start them. The mountain finishes them." I sat with this for a moment. I said, "What does it mean when a figure changes?" He looked at the trailhead. A family was loading up for a day hike. Parents, 2 small children, the children excitable in the way of children heading into the woods. He watched them with the same patient attention he brought to everything. He said, "It means the mountain is saying something." He said, "The figures are language. I make the forms, and the mountain puts meaning in them." He said, "Most people don't look closely enough to notice. The ones who notice, they're the ones the mountain is talking to specifically." I thought about the woman with the fox figure. I thought about what she'd said. It had changed. I thought about what she hadn't said. I asked August Lowe what happened to the hikers who noticed. He was quiet for a long time, long enough that I thought he wasn't going to answer. Then he said, "They finish differently than they started." I asked him what that meant. He picked up a piece of applewood from the bag and turned it in his hands, feeling for the shape in it, the thing that was already there and needed only the knife to bring it out. He said, "Some people go into the mountains and come out the same. Some come out more than they went in. And some—" he paused. He said, "Some come out less." He didn't elaborate, and I didn't press him. I drove back to the station and pulled the incident log for the previous 3 years, the full log, every incident report filed during the period I'd been aware of August Lowe and his figures, and I started looking for the pattern. It took me 2 weeks of evenings. The incident log was extensive, the way a busy district's log was always extensive, and most of what was in it had nothing to do with August Lowe or his figures. But there were entries.
11 of them over 3 years that described hikers coming out of the backcountry early, distressed, unable to give a clear account of why they'd left. In 5 of those cases, the ranger who handled the check-in had noted that the hiker was carrying a small, carved wooden figure. In 3 more cases, I found figures described in the general effects inventory, the list of what a distressed hiker had on them when they came in. 8 out of 11. I couldn't account for the other 3. I went back to August Lowe the following Saturday. I sat on the rock beside him and I told him what I'd found. I told it plainly, the way you tell things to people you want a straight answer from. 8 hikers in 3 years who came out of the backcountry in distress carrying his figures. He listened without changing expression. I said, "I need to know what's in the figures."
He looked at me with the stillness. He said, "I don't put anything in them. I told you, I start them. The mountain finishes them." I said, "Then the mountain is distressing people who carry your figures into it." He said, "The mountain is communicating with people who carry my figures into it." He said, "Distress is one response to communication. It's not the only one." I asked him about the ones who came out less, the ones he'd mentioned. He was quiet for a moment. He set down the wood he'd been working, and he looked at his hands. He said, "In 11 years, I've given figures to—" He stopped and considered. He said, "Hundreds of people." He said, "Most of them are fine." He said, "The mountains talk to everyone who goes into them. Most people don't hear it. The figures make some people hear it who wouldn't otherwise." I said, "And the ones who aren't fine?" He said, "The mountain says different things to different people." I asked him what it said to the ones who came out less. He picked up the wood again. He said, "I don't know. I only make the figures." He said, "I can tell you that when a figure comes back to me, when someone brings one back, it's always changed in the same way." I asked him how. He said, "It's finished." He said it quietly, with the weight of someone delivering a specific and carefully chosen word. He said, "When I make them, they're unfinished. That's intentional. That's the point. The mountain finishes them. When one comes back to me, it's complete. The form is fully resolved." He said, "I've had 4 come back in 11 years. He said, "All 4 of them showed the same thing when they were finished." I asked him what they showed. He looked at the trailhead again. The family had gone in. The parking area was quieter now. The morning's rush of early starters passed. He said, "A door." He said, "All 4 of them, when the mountain finished them, showed a door." He said, "I don't know what's on the other side of it." He picked up his knife and went back to work. I filed no formal report on August Lowe. He wasn't doing anything illegal. He was making gifts, giving them freely, and whatever the mountain was doing with them was not something I had regulatory authority over. I kept my own notes, and I kept watching. He stopped coming to Elk Garden 4 years ago. I asked at the county seat, discreetly, the way you ask things when you don't want to make them official, and I found that August Lowe had died the previous winter. Natural causes, in his home. He was 83. The woman who handled his estate told me, when I found a reason to call her, that when they cleared the house, they found the workshop where he'd done his carving. She said there were hundreds of unfinished figures on the shelves. She said she'd assumed he'd sold the finished ones, given that there were so few completed figures in the house. I asked her how many finished ones there were. She said 4. I asked her to describe them. She said they were small wooden figures, clearly the work of a skilled carver, each one distinct. She said one was a bear, one was a bird, one was a fox, and one was a human figure. She said they were all, she paused, finding the word, resolved. She said they looked complete in a way the others didn't. I asked her if there was anything unusual about them. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "They all show the same thing on their fronts. A rectangle. Like a..." She paused again. I said, "Like a door?" She said, "Yes, exactly like a door." I thanked her and ended the call and sat for a while thinking about 4 finished figures in a dead man's workshop and the hikers who carried his unfinished ones into these mountains, and what the mountains said to them, and what it meant for a mountain to finish a thing. I think about August Lowe sometimes when I'm at Elk Garden. His rock is still there, flat, low, at the edge of the parking area near the trailhead sign. No one sits on it now. The hikers pass it without knowing what it was. I think about what he said. The figures are a language. I think about what the mountain has been trying to say all these years to the people who went into it carrying a piece of applewood shaped by an old man's hands. I think about the door on the finished figures and what it means for a mountain to show you a door, and whether a door is an invitation or a warning, or simply a door. I haven't been able to decide. I don't go to Elk Garden on Saturdays anymore if I can avoid it. Not because of anything I expect to find, because of what I don't expect to find and still look for. An old man on a flat rock with a bag of applewood and a worn knife and a morning's work beside him. Because absence, in my experience, is its own kind of language. And these mountains speak it fluently. The shelter was quiet for a moment after Elias finished. The fire had burned to the point where it needed attention, and he gave it attention, adding wood with the same measured care, and the flame came back up, and the shadows resettled. Sam had his hands around his knees. He said, "The figures that came back to him, the 4 finished ones with the doors on them." He paused. "Those were from the hikers who came out distressed." "The ones who noticed," Elias said. "What about the ones who came out less, the ones he mentioned?" He paused again. "Their figures didn't come back." Elias looked at him across the fire. "No," he said, "they didn't." "Because, I don't know," Elias said. "I've thought about it for 15 years. I don't know." Greta had been very still during the story, stiller than her usual comfortable stillness. She said, "You said the mountain finishes the figures, puts meaning in them." She paused. "A door is a threshold, something you pass through." "Yes," Elias said. "The figures that came back showed a door. The hikers who carried them came out distressed, but they came out." She looked at the fire. "The hikers whose figures didn't come back, they didn't come out." "Some of them came out," Elias said carefully. "They came out less, as August put it. They came out changed in ways that were..." He stopped. "In ways that are hard to put in an incident report." Marcus had turned from the shelter opening. He was looking at Elias directly now, the full focus of someone who had been building a picture from fragments and had just found a piece that mattered. "The figures that didn't come back," he said. "What did those show when the mountain finished them?" "I don't know," Elias said. "August didn't tell me, and I didn't push him." He paused. "I think he knew. I think he'd seen them. I think that's why he kept making the figures unfinished, kept the door open, so to speak, for the mountain to do the finishing, rather than doing it himself. I think he understood that if he'd finished them himself, he'd have been saying something he wasn't qualified to say." "Not his language," Lena said quietly. "No, not his language." He looked into the fire for a moment. Then he looked at each of them in a specific way he had, the reading, not meeting quality, the assessment that went beyond what the eyes usually did. The 5th story is about a woman who comes down off the Grayson Highlands alone, carrying her missing partner's pack. Priya, who had been quiet and inward since the 2nd story, looked up. How does she move?
The question landed in the shelter with a weight that surprised even the person who'd asked it. Elias nodded slowly, as if the question confirmed something he'd been waiting for. "That," he said, "is exactly the right question."